Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking one of the most debated, talked about, and honestly influential texts in all of human history. We're looking at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, what's often called the primeval history. But listen, we're not going to just treat this like some random collection of ancient fables. No way. Our goal here is to really understand the basis of the thoughts laying under this biblical book. We're going to look at what the source material actually reveals, a highly structured, brilliantly engineered literary blueprint. It's absolutely fascinating.
Okay, let's dive right into how we're going to break this down. First up, decoding the primeval history. Then we'll look at the cosmic temple blueprint, followed by rebellion and structural collapse. After that, we hit the flood as decreation, and finally we'll wrap up with from Babel to blessing.
So, Part 1, Decoding the Primeval History. To really grasp the foundational thoughts in Genesis, we absolutely have to start by establishing the exact kind of literary genre we're dealing with here. Because honestly, if we read it with the wrong lens, we miss the entire point.
A lot of modern scholars classify Genesis 1 through 11 as mythohistory. Now hold on, that does not mean it's fake. It simply means the text uses the highly figurative, heavily symbolic language that was typical of the ancient world to describe real historical persons and events. Think about Homer's Iliad, right? It takes the actual historical reality of the Trojan War, but it historicizes it through this highly mythologized poetic lens. Genesis is doing something really similar. It's using a stylized, non-literal framework to convey some incredibly profound historical and theological realities.
And the contrasts here are just wild. While Genesis definitely shares a conceptual world with ancient Mesopotamian myths like the Atrahasis epic, it radically rewrites the script. It's basically a theological boxing match. In those Mesopotamian myths, the universe is governed by violent polytheistic chaos, and humans, well, they were created from clay and divine blood, basically just to be slave labor for these volatile, hungry gods. But look at the Genesis worldview. It presents this rigorously monotheistic, profoundly ethical creator who brings rational order totally out of chaos and who actually elevates humans as the absolute crown of creation. It's a total game changer.
So what's the structural glue holding this whole ancient text together? It's a very specific Hebrew phrase, the Toledot formula. You'll usually see it translated as, "These are the generations of." It pops up 5 times in these opening chapters, and it functions exactly like a cinematic zoom lens. It starts with this massive universal view of the entire cosmos, and then uses this phrase to transition and narrow the focus. It systematically filters out lines of descent until it zooms all the way in on one specific family of promise.
Which brings us to Part 2, the cosmic temple blueprint. With our framework fully in place, let's look at the famous creation account. We really need to realize that Genesis 1 is way less concerned with our modern scientific questions of material origins, and much more concerned with a deliberate theological architecture.
Just look at the perfect symmetry of creation here. The original problem introduced in Genesis is a chaotic void, right? It's unformed and it's empty. So God spends the first 3 days forming and separating spaces, light from dark, waters from sky, dry land from sea. Then, mapped directly across from that, days 4 through 6 are spent filling those exact same spaces with functionaries. You get the sun and moon, the birds and fish, and finally, animals and humanity. Creation, in this context, is this beautiful process of ordering, naming, and assigning function to a completely chaotic universe.
And that brings us to the 7th day, where God rests. Now, in the ancient world, deities didn't rest because they needed a quick nap. A deity rested by taking up residence in a newly built temple to actually rule from their throne. Think about what that means. It means the entire ordered cosmos is God's temple. And within this temple, humanity is created as the imago Dei, the image of God. In the ancient Near East, kings would literally put physical statues in distant provinces to mark their sovereign boundaries. Genesis is essentially asserting that humans are God's living statues, placed right here to steward and rule the earth on His behalf.
Now, if the cosmos is the macro temple, pay close attention to how Eden is described. It's not just some pleasant garden, it is the terrestrial Holy of Holies. It's situated on a holy mountain. God walks there, and the text uses a specific Hebrew word that's later used for God's presence in the Israelite tabernacle. On top of that, Adam is told to work and keep the garden. Those 2 specific verbs, they are only ever used together elsewhere in the biblical text to describe the duties of the Levite priests guarding the sanctuary. So Adam is essentially the primordial high priest. How cool is that?
All right, Part 3, Rebellion and Structural Collapse. Sadly, this pristine architecture doesn't last.
the entry of the serpent causes this beautifully designed foundational structure to crack. And remember, the serpent in this ancient context represents a supernatural entity actively trying to subvert the divine hierarchy.
The whole temptation is structurally designed to shift focus away from God's immense generosity and point it right at his one single boundary. Just look at the rapid psychological progression of the fall here. Eve saw that the fruit was good, she desired it to make one wise, and then she took of it. This is so much more than just eating an apple. This represents humanity autonomously usurping the right to define good and evil for themselves, rather than just relying on divine wisdom. And Adam's failure? It's his passive silence. He completely fails his priestly duty to guard that sacred space from spiritual pollution.
Following that tragic expulsion from Eden, the destructive power of sin just rapidly escalates. We start to see two completely divergent bloodlines emerge. On one side, you have the line of Cain. And it's a profound paradox, really. Cain's line achieves these brilliant cultural and technological advancements. They build the first city, they invent metallurgy, they create music, but they mask all of it in unchecked violence, which ultimately culminates in Lamech's terrifying boast of 77-fold vengeance. But then, on the other side, the line of Seth contrasts this entirely. Instead of unchecked violence, this bloodline is characterized by longevity, by walking with God, and crucially, by preserving covenant hope.
This moral decay eventually hits a massive crisis point with the crossing of cosmic boundaries right before the flood. The text says the sons of God interbred with the daughters of men, creating the Nephilim. Now, scholars generally hold one of three main views on this. Either it was fallen angels crossing a spiritual boundary, the righteous line of Seth compromising with the pagan line of Cain, or despotic kings claiming divine status. But whatever interpretation you lean toward, the point is that Genesis is radically inverting those Mesopotamian myths we talked about. What neighboring cultures celebrated as this glorious divine human interbreeding that brought advanced knowledge, Genesis exposes as a catastrophic, totally demonic violation of boundaries.
Which brings us to part 4, the flood as decreation. This massive boundary violation forces a divine response, and that's the flood. But we really need to view this narrative as more than just a disaster story about a big boat and a bunch of animals. It's actually the systematic, terrifying undoing of the cosmic architecture that was so carefully built back in Genesis 1.
The flood is literally the exact theological reversal of creation. It's a terrifying decreation. Remember how God separated the chaotic waters with a firmament dome back in Genesis 1? Well, during the flood, the windows of the heavens and the fountains of the deep are opened back up. Those boundaries are completely erased. The primordial chaos is allowed to just flood right back into the ordered space, literally sinking the world back to the uninhabitable, chaotic void of day 1.
And the way this is written brilliantly illustrates just how meticulously crafted this text actually is. Some past critics used to claim the flood story was just poorly stitched together from a bunch of conflicting sources. But modern literary analysis shows it's actually an incredible chiasm. That's an X-shaped literary pattern where the first half of the story mirrors the second half but in reverse order. It descends into disaster step by step, hits a massive center turning point, and then ascends back into restoration step by step. It's like a giant literary puzzle coming together.
And right at the very center of that massive X-shaped structure is this one incredibly pivotal phrase, "But God remembered Noah." That is the turning point of the entire disaster. The chaotic decreation finally stops. God sends a wind, a ruach in Hebrew, which deliberately echoes the exact same spirit wind that hovered over the waters in Genesis 1, to dry up the flood. The process of recreation has officially begun. So when Noah exits the ark, he's essentially functioning as a second Adam, and God establishes a brand new covenant. But notice, this one includes some specific concessions for a humanity that is clearly still flawed. The command to multiply is reiterated, but now they're actually allowed to eat meat. Strict judicial sanctions are put in place against violence to protect the Imago Dei. And finally, a massive cosmic covenant is struck. God places his rainbow in the sky. And listen, in the ancient context, it's not just a pretty weather phenomenon. In Hebrew, this is literally a war bow. By pointing his weapon up and away from the earth, God is effectively signing an eternal treaty of peace with his creation. It's incredibly powerful.
And finally, part 5, from Babel to blessing. As we transition into our final act here, we quickly see that the human heart wasn't magically cleansed by the floodwaters. The surviving architecture of humanity faces its ultimate crisis, which leads to a totally unexpected, massive pivot in the text.
Following the flood, the earth is repopulated. In what's known as the Table of Nations, we see exactly 70 nations emerge from Noah's 3 sons. Now, in the ancient biblical worldview, 70 is a deeply, deeply symbolic number. It represents the absolute totality of the human family, right before they are scattered across the cosmic geography. The whole shebang, basically.
And that scattering happens at the Tower of Babel. Humanity outright defies the command to fill the earth. Instead, they try to use human technology to build a tower to the heavens to make a name for themselves. It is the absolute height of human hubris, and it results in the divine confusion of their languages and their scattering. So the really crucial point here is the tectonic literary shift that happens right after this. Literally in the very next chapter, God approaches an elderly, childless nomad named Abram. While Babel tried to make a name for themselves and ended up cursed, God promises to make Abram's name great, and through him to bless all the scattered families of the earth. It's a complete paradigm shift.
God initiates this massive rescue plan through one single family to reverse the universal curses of the primeval history. And that leaves us with a really provocative question to chew on. How will this single family's blueprint reshape the rest of history? Because to truly understand the rest of the Bible, you have to realize that absolutely everything that follows is God's answer to the architectural collapse we just witnessed in Genesis 1 through 11. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.